Hey, it's Brett, and we are continuing Assata's Escape as Disencarceral Practice by Professor Sam Tenorio. This is section 2, segment 2, I don't know. According to law, 2009, while prisons have always been a form of social control, for women they have been historically used to morally condemn behaviors that are seen from deviating from notions of proper womanhood. In many ways, criminalization was used to organize understandings of black people's gender. Callie Gross, in 2006, cites the studies of Cesar Lombroso, who claimed that an absence of a clear division between black men and black women played a decisive role in female criminality. To demonstrate how criminality became tied to the proposition that black women were not properly gendered. In this formulation, black womanhood was rendered dangerous because it was understood to exist in excess in body type, strength, behavior, and criminal abilities and desires. The figure of the black female criminal was constructed as aggressively on the prowl as if to demonstrate an active and oncoming threat. In effect, what was painted as the portrait of the ferocious black woman that was used to validate the use of violence and the suppression of black women's alleged crimes. While white women's criminality could always be displaced or explained away, the criminality of black women was linked to an inherent depravity. This narrative demarcation was dependent on the belief that black people cross lines, that they are excessive, that they move beyond the constitutive borders of humanity's categories. Further, the charge of vagrancy adduced explicitly sexual violences, where in part the danger ascribed to black people was the threat they posed to white morality. Specifically, the trope of black hypersexuality fueled fears of black men's desire for white women and black women's seduction of white men. Vagrancy was a sexually charged indictment, emphasizing the imminent incursion of unbridled uh, black sexuality when gone unchecked by a profusion of white supervision and surveillance. Historically, black populations have been associated with sexual transgressions, if only for the fact that in urban areas, black neighborhoods were often the ones strategically arranged as enclaves of sexual commerce and vice. This immoral and sexually charged distortion was central to the criminal caricatures that Gross argues became mass-produced mediation for white fantasy and shaped desire. Black women especially spotlight the ways in which race, gender, and sexuality shape criminality. She demonstrates that the shift in their portrayal from the ultimate submissive of slavery to the dangerous urban aggressor post-emancipation was a consequence of the subversion, at least in theory, of uninhibited white access to black women's bodies. The trope of hypersexuality was crucial to the criminalization of blackness for the benefit of, and in opposition to, those holders of whiteness. Here, black women's criminality was explicitly tied to a representation of deviant and unchecked sexuality that was subsequently fetishized as compulsive, uncontrollable, and roving. As such, while black women often had complex reasons for engaging in criminal behavior, narrations of their crimes vilified them with simplistic racial tropes that were then disseminated and are consumed in the service of white supremacy. Crime and the danger of the unchecked black movement were exaggerated in such a way as to shore up traditional notions of white masculinity as well as female morality. Moreover, these representations galvanized and justified urban policies long after emancipation and into the contemporary movement, heavily influencing white authority over black urban life. By promoting fear, the rhetoric of criminalization used against blacks as based in strategic manipulations and omissions, has been often traded upon for political power, with the tough on crime attitude being the easiest and most risk-free way to secure support from any constituency without necessarily revealing racial bias. In effect, the U.S. government, especially from Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency on, has been able to chisel out ideological boundaries of middle-class social and cultural values that normalize white dominance and black danger, hinging on the imminence of their ambulation beyond their place. As Davis has pointed out, blacks, then and now, are almost always punished for practices that go unchecked when performed by whites. Furthermore, the presumed level of danger posed by blacks to white dominion is often not represented in the crimes that get incarcerated. Black women convicted and the socioeconomic conditions from which these crimes emerge as conventionally disassociated from their practice by the courts and outside audiences. According to Shakur, where she lists some of the crimes that black women were often in for in the 1970s. Jostling was pickpocketing, boosting was lifting, juggling paper was writing bad checks, and dragging or playing drag was conning. In her own case, Shakur's crimes against the state indicate how black criminalization existed at the point of black threat to white dominion, and this articulation is historically rooted. It is not by chance that black codes, those collections of laws with broadly defined and broadly enforced rules about vagrancy, specifically outlaw runaways, the assembly of free or enslaved blacks, the disorderly, and those who neglect their calling. Vagrancy in relation to black population is always a declaration of permissible movements and always a repudiation of dissent. In that way, the charge of vagrancy was always already paraphrases a critique and prohibition of black political practice. Disencarceration. The decision to work with and through Assata Shakur's flight from prison was catalyzed by my approach to black practices that appeared to introduce their own black anarchist orientations in their exertion against carceral geographies established and maintained by colonial racial authority. Shakur's is an understudied subversion of this authority that reveals an intellect of insurrection, according to Gilman Olpowski in 2006. That is, I look to Shakur's act as providing its own intellectual analysis of the world, what James has called maroon philosophy, at the borders reimagining freedom through flight. End quote. What is key within James's formulation is that flight itself is the practice through which a philosophy of freedom can emerge, not unlike Gilman Olpowski's assertion that we must consider the revolt for what it says, what it speaks. End quote. Indeed, as an upheaval as speaking. This line diverges from an understanding of freedom as a destination emerged, fully formed from Zeus's head, which defines the practice as simply a mechanism of an overdetermined machine. James instead invites us to consider the philosophical content of Shakur's practice as a theorization of liberation, one that exists at the borderlands of democracy. Thus, instead of privileging questions of what is achieved by her break from prison, attention is rather driven to consider the questions it urges. To center this is not, however, an attempt to distill Shakur's political ideologies. Her thoughts and ideas are neither simple nor straightforward, but are necessarily complicated, complex, and sometimes contradictory. Instead, to shift attention to her escapement is to bring theoretical attention to her practices as always already exceeding those ideologies, where, to borrow the words of Trullo, discourse is always lagged behind practice because Revolution was indeed the limits of the thinkable. End quote. Davis has argued that for the political prisoner, the contact with the criminal justice system, quote, has occurred because one has lodged a protest, in one form or another, against the conditions which nail blacks to this orbit of oppression, end quote. Shakur, within Davis's evocative framing, can then be understood as attempting to shoot out of this orbit, to break with the system in its entirety. As such, her practice must be understood in contradistinction to law-abiding dissent, which often has broader social acceptance because it exists in accordance with models of civil disobedience and commonly accepted moral values, as well as demonstrates a proximity to the institutional power from which the disenfranchised are barred. For Shakur, what comes to be condemned by the wider public is the black anarchism of her practice, the rejection of the validity of the nation state itself and legitimacy of its legal and moral upstanding. In keeping with the presumption that black women pose an inherent danger, gratuitous abuse and surveillance are built into the processes of the prison's discipline. In the prison, black women are overdetermined as sexually accessible, where privacy, even for the most intimate practices and places, is non-existent, and where cavity searches and sexual assaults are routine. As such, the escape of Assata Shakur is not just a moment where an individual was simply fed up with being told what to do, but a break with a regime that renders the life of the black incarcerated woman worthless, and her movement is always subject to the authority of whiteness. Yet disincarceration, rather than escape, is used to discuss Assata Shakur's spatial interruption of the prison for several reasons. To be sure, while Shakur does break out of prison, her continued exile reflects the political interval in which her practice resides and demonstrates the necessary incompleteness of her action against the reterritorializing power of the state. Providing this alternative conceptual frame to understand her escape is to take up Hess's 2014 call to consider the complexities of black subversive freedoms, or rather, how black anarchist practices embody the meaning of freedom subversely. The formulation of black anarchism takes seriously how escapist pathways work through remaining subject to colonial racial governance, but never racially assimilated in Western hegemony. As such, the aim is to illustrate the continual, iterative, and processual nature of escape. Shakur must repeatedly elude Western control, of which the United States is in this case the biggest stakeholder, in order to maintain the secrecy of her whereabouts. In this way, her evasions indicate an exertion of nonlinear trajectories of black movement beyond the dominion of white authority. They embody an insurgent transience against the spatial requirements of white supremacy, but maintain a distance from the interpretations of completion that the word escape seems to stipulate, which fail to critically engage the carceral conditions that continue to limit Shakur's life specifically and black life generally. This conceptualization thus reframes black anarchism as a black liberationist politics, a gesture toward freedom that is not yet achieved. As an outlaw, Shakur's break from prison cannot be an achievement of freedom because her flight is not homologous with freedom from the rule of race, according to Hess. Its policing, segregating, and carceral conditions. Shakur's disencarceral practice functions against the carceral geographies meant to contain her, but her own movement remains subject to its mechanisms of vagrancy. As such, it is a practice that occurs within the conceptual fields of both freedom and unfreedom. It indicts the colonial racial geographies of unfreedom in its deed, but not, or cannot, yet imagine a free life in its racial geographies of unfreedom in its deed, but does not, or cannot yet imagine free life in its claim. Thus, her practice represents a deed that precedes its demand, rejecting a linear trajectory with a coherent or named outcome from which we are to measure the accomplishment of her practice and realization of her claim by Western standards of success. And this configuration, it is simply the source of the standards that matter. Not simply, but the standards themselves. The appeal proposes that to be held to standards is to remain beholden to a horizon that shapes and dictates its own appraisal as much as it refuses the carceral organization of the state as the governing law of race. It is an anticipatory abandonment of the prison that is the ultimate expression of the law that does not yet have a destination. It is an anticipation of something else. Shakur forces one to reckon with the deed of flight as deed, that is, as practice, the practice of the escape, rather than its destination. However, reckoning with this practice does not mean knowing this practice. This is clearest in the case of Assata Shakur's biography, when we encounter the book's transition from prison to Cuba as an absent chapter, as fugitivity of the literature, as Hess argues in relation to slave narratives as black fugitive thought. The latter, quote, can only be sustained through the emancipation inherent in escape from the colonial racial foreclosure underpinning consent to Western hegemony, end quote. Shakur's textual omission of her practices sounds an evasion of a system of representation that buttresses the colonial racial authority. In this, she pushes back on the very mechanisms for and desires of Western liberal horizons, its assimilations and appropriations. Her textual tactic is a challenge for both the processes of knowledge production and the production of knowledge itself. That is, even as loss gives rise to longing, the omission questions our archival desires, challenging us to respect what we cannot know. But by not narrating how she did it, she denies the pressures of the reproductive economy and demonstrates a necessity to work through the unknown as a productive space of politics, the non-reproductive as productive. In the steps of Trulot's study of the Haitian Revolution as a series of practices that exceed ideology, thinking about Shakur's carceral evasions require us to similarly think about how their very deed is incompatible with the dominant West and is subsequently undercut by a failure of narration, silence through what Trulot calls formulas of erasure and formulas of banalization. The textual absence of Shakur's practice, the missing chapter as it were, can then be understood as walking the line of silence in secret. Historian Greg Childs has differentiated between the two in his study of sedition in colonial Brazil. He explains the difference between silence and secret as a matter of recovery, where the former is an omission that awaits revelation in order for the ascription of value, often in the part of the historian, and the latter is more commensurate with non-existence, according to Childs. As an attempt to keep things from the knowable, Childs pushes us to think of the secret not as an obstacle for understanding from the unknowable, or for understanding black anarchism, but as fundamental to it. It is an indication of the possibility of reevaluating that emptiness, according to Phelan in 93. Shakur then works against the temptation to fill in the gaps or provide closure where there is none. as well as pushes back on our desire to know, even as it provokes a necessity to study. That is, her iterative escapement requires that our theorization in so much as a new approach to such practices is necessary, but simultaneously indicates that we cannot approach these practices with an intent to know these practices with any certainty. It is at once a model of political praxis, as well as a confession of the paradox and conundrum of indexing the disencarceral tactic. We only know of Assata's deed, and of that we know very little. The drive is instead what we can begin to learn from, rather than about, these practices when we approach them through an alternative frame. What can these practices teach us about politics and teach us about the study of politics? In the case of Assata Shakur's continuing story, we must contend with the absent chapter as the necessity of that which is not yet finished, that which remains anticipatory and provisional. We must contend with the ways in which the very possibilities emergent in her practice are also those that clog the smooth machinery of the representation necessary to the circulation of capital, as Fallon wrote in 1993. The omission resists the reconciliation of recovery and processes that have failed so many imprisoned people in the past. As such, it challenges the liberal underpinnings of some of black political practices that call for assimilation and representation as the route to liberation. Here, the autobiography mirrors the physical practice of disencarceration, where the passage is both discursive and material, providing a textual mime to the ephemerality of Shakur's disappearing act. In other words, the absent presence of her flight in the text itself, an index of her flight, embodying its transient performance. This presence is signed by the tradition, the poem that connects the postscript in Shakur's 2001 final chapters in prison, where she names various modes and methods of dissent, refusal, and defiance that make up a long black political history. In using the poem in place of a narrative account of her own elopement, Shakur locates herself within this tradition of struggle, situating her practice among similar forms such as jumping the slave ship, running from the plantation, and the Underground Railroad. In each stanza, Shakur names practices within the black radical tradition, along with a repetition of carrying it on. Tunneling between the prison and the outside, the poem presents Shakur's migration from the U.S. prison to Cuba as an underground and unseen practice, where the reader immediately recognizes Shakur has made it out with the simple word freedom as an opening of the text's final pages. Her own practice is an unmarked and unknown passage, augmenting an evasion of colonial racial authority and naming the political inflection of abscondence outside the legislative and the electoral, while reiterating the necessity of its persistence. A reflection on this continuance does not mean to traffic in romantic notions of resistance, because often conceptualizations of resistance also fall within the confines of their liberal genealogies that march toward completion and attempt closure for stories that are exceedingly and excessively beyond closure. Instead, to employ Hartman and Stephen Best's evocative conceptualization, the textual tunnel beneath the surveillance of the West demarcates the fugitive space that is between the compliant and the extra-linguistic mode of black noise that exists outside the parameters of any strategy or plan for remedy. Shakur exerts a racial chaos that is inaudible to the Western project and represents the political interval which elaborates the distance between the destruction of the old world and the awaited hour of deliverance. And, as Sarah Cervenak argues, it's in those moments of inaudibility where one bucks the attempt of scripted translation by the state that black movement aligns with the free. Shakur signifies a move outside the frame of Western order that as yet cannot find its completion, because practices of disencarceration always exceed legibility and encapsulate imaginings beyond our comprehension, and because they continue to be situated within a governing order of white supremacy that is dependent on their repression. As such, while Shakur herself escapes prison only once, she must continue to evade the carceral conditions that lie in its wake. Marriage, exile. If the entanglement of movement and punishment has been at all instructive, it has illustrated that carcerality has existed before the prison and is always expanding beyond it. As such, not only must carceral egress as a repeated practice, but it runs up against the dislocations and disorientations inherent in the conditions of exile. Shakur makes her way out of a draconian penal asylum in Cuba, where she is able to move not only beyond the concrete walls of Clinton Correctional Facility, but also past the borders of the United States and into a communist nation meant to represent all things exceeding U.S. control and influence. However, while her locomotion across U.S. national borders and relative freedom in Cuba mark out a new experience for Shakur that is categorically different from that of her life inside the prison institution, this change does not overcome the carceral geographies that produce her position as always already subject to the violence of the state. In her words, she had achieved her dream. She was elated and ecstatic, and she was also completely disoriented, where everything was the same, yet everything was different. Often, when the story told of Shakur, it is her unfreedom in Cuba. It is both within and without the cell in United States that is highlighted, and in contrast, her exile in Cuba encapsulates her escape from racial oppression. This discrepancy, while sometimes while sometimes unintentional, not only trades in a long-standing and now much maligned dichotomy between the racial oppression of the United States and the racial democracy of Latin America, De La Fuente and Andrews, 2018, but also misrepresents the complicated status of what it means to be a modern-day Maroon. To be in exile is indeed to live a different condition of containment that remains under the watchful eye of the surveilling West, but where Shakur's fugitive flesh continues to signify not only a criminal, but a commodity on the run. Marinage, to run away, to jump the slave ship, is indeed practical, a sort of transience. It is both transitional and ephemeral. It's more passage than destination, yet it also speaks a kind of impermanence, for better or for worse. And Shakur's transience continues to work against and within the vagrancy that is produced in the criminalization of black people and black politics. While her movements oppose the movement of vagrancy manufactured through various mechanisms of criminalization, they also remain subject to it. Shakur is a Maroon, no doubt, but unlike the Maroons, has not yet found freedom, or maybe more precisely, has not yet escaped unfreedom. Parenti's 1997 interview with her is ripe with this tenuous or transient existence. She is simultaneously a resident of the ultimate Palenque and must keep a low profile because security is still a big concern. As a political refugee in exile in Cuba, Shakur is forced to lay low because her movements continue to be overdetermined by the surveillance of the West and of the U.S. government in particular. In Cuba, she remains restricted to lands that are at once beyond the reach of the West and its American handmaidens as well as established by those very forces. When it comes to the realization that there exists no fixed sites of freedom and that reach of the West is hardly contained by geographic boundaries, her exile focuses our attention on the constitution of national borders by the excessive policing in and of whiteness. Her fleeing ensures a displacement and diffusion of carcerality that reveals itself in a new form that, while supposedly softer in appearance, remains materially significant as she remains subject to incessant desires of the state. In this, U.S. surveillance simultaneously plays on an othering of Cuba, while subsequently demonizing her political refugee status that is made manifest through a constructed resonance with Cuba's communist and thus un-American subsistence. This begins to lay bare the construction of her identity as terrorist, a construction that reimagines a McCarthyist trajectory that claims the confluence of any dissent from the state with presuppositions of the un-American. Shakur comes to embody both the desire for the FBI to retrieve a black fugitive as well as the United States' attempt to invade the sanctuary space for dissidents that Castro's racialized Cuba had come to represent. Cuba's anti-imperialist commitments and public support for the struggle of black Americans, such as Shakur, has endeared it to those identifying with anti-racism and black liberation, while also angering the United States government. Indeed, this small nation has come to symbolize a resistance to state constructed as an imperial behemoth that runs counter to ever-growing United States desires for control that date back to the Cuban Revolution's challenge to the Monroe Doctrine. As such, the policing of Assata Shakur accommodates and makes further possible the added benefit of policing Cuba. And I thought I would be wrapping it up with this one, but there'll be a short part 3. And rest in power, Assata Shakur passed away. So I will be reading some more stuff of hers soon, hopefully. And thanks.